Nobody expected Ukraine to show up here, a country fighting for its own survival thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf, with no navy to speak of and a war raging on its own soil. And yet, right now, Ukrainian drone experts are on the ground in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. Ukrainian naval engineers are sharing classified operational blueprints with Gulf military commanders. 10-year defense agreements worth billions have been signed, and a small, low-cost, unmanned boat that humiliated Russia's Black Sea fleet is being quietly studied by the nations desperate to reopen the most important waterway on Earth. The United States has the most powerful military in history, and it is still trying to brute force its way through the Strait of Hormuz problem. Ukraine, a country that started this war without a functioning navy, has already cracked the code. This is the story of how a 4-year war in Eastern Europe became the most unexpected factor in a Middle Eastern crisis that is shaking the foundations of global energy markets. And why the lesson Ukraine learned the hard way, in waters the world barely noticed, is now the blueprint that the Gulf needs most. To understand what Ukraine is offering, you first have to understand what Iran is doing. And to understand what Iran is doing, you have to go back to something that Ukraine's foreign minister recognized immediately when the Gulf crisis erupted. When Iran began choking off the Strait of Hormuz after the US and Israeli strikes on February 28, 2026, Ukraine's foreign minister spoke up publicly. He said it was painfully familiar. Russia had done the same thing in the Black Sea, blocked maritime trade, used it as an economic weapon, tried to strangle a country into submission without having to fight it outright in the open. The tactics were different. Russia used warships. Iran is using fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, and drones. But the strategic logic was identical. Control the water, control the economy, force a political outcome. Ukraine learned that lesson at enormous cost. From the moment Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, the Black Sea became a weapon. Russia's Black Sea fleet imposed a blockade on Ukraine's ports that cost the country roughly $20 billion in annual revenue. Ukraine's grain exports, the food supply for hundreds of millions of people across Asia and Africa, could not reach their buyers. The fleet controlled the water. The water controlled Ukraine's economy, and Russia believed that control would be permanent. It was not permanent. What Ukraine did next is one of the most remarkable military innovations of the 21st century, and it happened precisely because Ukraine had nothing. No fleet, no warships. Ukraine's only major naval vessel, a frigate, was scuttled at its own dock in February 2022 to prevent it from being captured. Ukraine went into that war with essentially zero conventional naval capability, and within 18 months, it had forced Russia's Black Sea fleet into the most humiliating strategic retreat in modern naval history. The weapon Ukraine built was the Sea Baby, a low-cost, remotely operated unmanned surface vessel packed with explosives, capable of traveling over 1,000 kilometers autonomously, equipped with AI-assisted targeting, and upgradable to carry rocket systems, aerial drones, and sophisticated electronic warfare packages. The concept was brutally simple. You do not need a fleet to destroy a fleet. You need a drone that costs a fraction of what the warship costs and is nearly impossible to stop at scale. The results were not subtle. Ukrainian naval drones damaged or destroyed more than 24 Russian naval vessels between 2022 and 2024. They sank the Moskva, Russia's Black Sea Fleet flagship, an event not seen since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. They struck Sevastopol harbor, breaching layered Russian defenses, hitting ships at their moorings. They pushed the entire Black Sea Fleet from its historical base in Crimea north to Novorossiysk on the Russian coast. And even there, Ukraine followed. In December 2025, the Security Service of Ukraine executed what experts called the world's first successful combat strike by an underwater unmanned vehicle against a submarine, targeting a Russian submarine at pier in Novorossiysk, a port on Russian sovereign territory, heavily fortified, presumed impenetrable, penetrated from below the surface. By any independent military analysis, Ukraine destroyed roughly a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet and denied the rest freedom of movement in a sea that Russia had controlled for decades. The British Ministry of Defense documented it plainly. Russia's fleet size proved no match for Ukraine's maritime innovations. Ukraine had built a navy out of nothing but necessity, software, and low-cost hardware. And in doing so, it had created a playbook for how a smaller, asymmetric force defeats a conventionally superior naval power in a confined waterway. That playbook is now worth more than oil. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not the Black Sea, it is smaller, more enclosed, more strategically critical, and the economic consequences of its closure are orders of magnitude larger. About 20% of the world's daily oil and liquefied natural gas supply moves through a choke point barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. When Iran moved to shut that waterway down following the US-Israeli strikes, the ripple effects hit every economy on Earth within days. Oil prices spiked toward $120 a barrel. Asian nations that depend on Gulf exports for 90% of their energy, imports declared emergencies. The Philippines announced a national energy crisis. India's ceramic industry, employing 400,000 workers, shut down for an entire month. China, despite 3 months of strategic reserves, was already watching fuel prices climb 20%. And the U.S. Energy Information Administration warned this was the largest supply disruption since the 1970s oil crisis. Gulf states that had nothing to do with the decision to go to war were bleeding. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain collectively cut 9 million barrels per day of production in a single month. Not because they wanted to, because with Iran threatening any tanker attempting to transit Hormuz, the risk of sending vessels through had become commercially and physically unsurvivable. Capital Economics projected GDP losses of 10 to 15% for Gulf states if the conflict persisted beyond 3 months. These are not developing economies absorbing a shock. These are some of the wealthiest nations on Earth, watching their entire economic model dissolve in real time. They needed a solution, not just a military solution, a strategic asymmetric solution that could match Iran's tactics without requiring a full naval war. Something that could be deployed fast, scaled quickly, and operated by Gulf forces trained on the fly by people who had already made this work. And then Zelensky landed in Jeddah. His arrival was unannounced. His meetings with Mohammed bin Salman were quiet. But the substance of what was discussed behind those closed doors was not quiet at all. Ukraine, now in its 5th year of fighting Iranian-designed drones used by Russia, was offering something nobody else had: a complete, battle-tested, proven system for defeating exactly the kind of threat Iran was deploying in the Gulf. The conversation was direct. Zelensky framed it without ambiguity. For 5 years, Ukrainians have been fighting against the same terrorist attacks with ballistic missiles and drones that the Iranian regime is now using against Gulf nations. Ukraine knew the Shahed drone intimately. It had been killing Ukrainian civilians since Russia began deploying Iranian-designed variants in massive swarms. By February 2026, Russia had launched nearly 5,600 drones at Ukraine in a single month, a number that would have been impossible without Iran's foundational drone technology and the expertise Iran sent into Russia to help build production lines. Ukraine had spent years developing the answer to that specific threat, and now the Gulf was facing the same threat in a different geography. The deals that followed were extraordinary in scope. Saudi Arabia and Qatar signed 10-year security cooperation agreements. The UAE finalized similar terms shortly after. The agreements covered naval drones, electronic warfare systems, air defense interceptors, software packages, and, perhaps most critically, deployed human expertise. Zelensky confirmed that 201 Ukrainian drone specialists had already been sent to the Middle East before the deals were even formalized. Expert teams were on the ground, assessing defense postures, identifying gaps, and beginning training programs for Gulf military personnel. These were not consultants. These were engineers and operators who had built and deployed these systems under live fire, in real combat conditions, against an adversary using the exact same weapons Iran was now deploying in the Gulf. The economic architecture of the deals was equally significant. Gulf states are partly compensating Ukraine in energy supplies. For a country whose own energy infrastructure has been systematically targeted by Russian missiles for years, guaranteed access to Gulf energy is not a small thing. It reduces Ukraine's exposure and gives Kiev leverage it has never had in a region that has historically looked to Moscow rather than Kiev for its military relationships. That shift is perhaps the deeper story underneath the tactical agreements. Russia has spent decades cultivating influence across the Middle East. Arms deals, security guarantees, diplomatic relationships, countries that bought Russian weapons, trained with Russian advisors, and saw Moscow as the dominant external military power in the post-Soviet space. That architecture is now fracturing. Nations that previously had no reason to engage with Ukraine are signing decade-long strategic defense partnerships. Nations that bought from Moscow are now contracting with Kiev. Nations that watched Russian drone technology spread from Iran to Russian battlefields to Gulf skies are now paying Ukraine to teach them how to shoot those same drones down. Ukraine's chief foreign policy analyst put it plainly: our experience is something we can trade for a stronger negotiating position. We are showing the world we are a more interesting and valuable partner than Russia. Countries in the Middle East had long-standing ties with Russia. That is changing now. Putin is watching it happen. Russian energy, profits from the Gulf War's oil price surge are real, but Russia's strategic positioning in the region is eroding in exchange for those profits. The Gulf states that might once have turned to Moscow in a security crisis are now on the phone with Kiev. What Ukraine is actually offering the Gulf can be broken into 3 distinct capabilities that together constitute a complete asymmetric counter to Iran's strategy in the Strait. The first is the interceptor drone. Ukraine spent over 3 years developing low-cost drone interceptors, specifically designed to destroy Shahed-type attack drones before they reach their targets. These interceptors cost as little as $1,500 to build, a fraction of the Patriot and THAAD missiles Gulf states have been expending to knock down Iranian drones that cost far less to produce. In some months during the war, over 70% of Russian Shahed variants targeting Ukrainian cities were taken out by these interceptors before reaching their destinations. The Gulf has been using the equivalent of a sledgehammer to kill mosquitoes. Ukraine is offering them a net, and a net that costs almost nothing compared to what the Gulf is currently burning through. The second is the naval drone system. The Sea Baby and its successor variants represent a capability the Gulf has never possessed and Iran never anticipated facing. Ukraine's upgraded Sea Baby now has a range of 1,500 kilometers, can carry a 2-ton payload, features AI-assisted targeting, can launch aerial drones from the water, and has been evolving continuously in live combat. In the constrained geography of the Strait of Hormuz, a distributed swarm of such vessels could impose costs on Iran's fast attack boats and naval assets that no amount of Iranian anti-ship missiles or drone swarms could easily offset. You do not need warships to deny a strait. Ukraine proved that in the Black Sea. The same logic applies in Hormuz. The geography actually favors the defender. Small, fast, autonomous, expendable platforms operating in swarms are harder to stop at scale than a conventional fleet is to sink. The third is the complete system architecture. This is what separates Ukraine's offer from simply selling hardware. Zelensky was explicit about it. Ukraine is not offering simple sales. It is offering defense lines, software, electronic warfare integration, training programs, and a systemic approach built around the specific threat profile that Iran presents. The Sea Baby did not work in isolation in the Black Sea. It worked as part of a layered strategy that combined coastal defense missiles, aerial drone support, real-time surveillance, electronic warfare, and carefully coordinated swarm tactics. Ukraine is offering to replicate that entire system in the Gulf. Not parts of it, all of it. The European Union's special envoy to the Gulf region pointed to the Black Sea Grain Initiative as a diplomatic model for Hormuz. The practical military model is also from the Black Sea. Ukraine built a maritime humanitarian corridor through an active blockade and maintained it under sustained Russian pressure for over a year. Odessa still receives 200 cargo ships every month, despite everything Russia has thrown at it. That did not happen by accident. It happened because Ukraine built a system, not just a weapon. The Gulf states want that system. And Ukraine, for the first time in the modern era, has something the richest nations in the world are willing to pay generously to obtain. There is a layer of poetic justice in all of this that is difficult to overstate. Iran provided Russia with thousands of Shahed drones, deployed Iranian experts to teach Russian engineers how to build them domestically, and helped Russia construct dedicated production facilities inside Russian territory solely to manufacture Iranian-designed weapons. Russia now produces close to 1,000 long-range drones every day, almost all of them based on Iranian designs. Those drones have killed Ukrainian civilians, destroyed Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and forced Ukraine to spend 4 years developing the countermeasures it is now selling back to Iran's neighbors. Iran armed Russia. Russia battered Ukraine. Ukraine built the answer. And now Ukraine is selling that answer to the nations that Iran is currently attacking. The circle is complete, and it closed in a way that nobody, least of all Tehran, anticipated. There is also a timing element here that matters enormously. The Gulf crisis, despite the 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan in early April 2026, remains fundamentally unresolved. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has already stated that Middle Eastern oil production will not return to anything close to pre-conflict levels until late 2026 at the earliest. The structural causes of the conflict, Iran's regional strategy, the future of its nuclear program, the question of permanent Hormuz access, none of these have been addressed by a 2-week pause. When the ceasefire expires, when negotiations in Islamabad either produce a framework or collapse, the military situation in the Gulf will resume where it left off. And the Gulf states know this. The 10-year agreements Zelensky signed are not a response to a temporary crisis. They are a recognition that the threat Iran poses to Gulf infrastructure and shipping is not going away. Gulf leaders understand they cannot rely on the United States alone to manage that threat indefinitely. They cannot absorb the economic cost of another Hormuz closure. And they cannot keep spending Patriot missiles at the rate required to defeat Iranian drone swarms without eventually running out of the inventory they need for their own defense. Ukraine's interceptor drones, at $1,500 apiece, solve an economic problem that no other partner has even framed correctly. Gulf states don't just need a way to shoot down Iranian drones. They need a way to shoot them down cheaply enough to sustain a long-term asymmetric campaign without bankrupting their air defense budgets. Ukraine figured out that arithmetic out of necessity. The Gulf is buying that arithmetic now out of desperation. What makes this geopolitical moment so unusual is that the country driving it is the one everyone expected to be a passive victim. Ukraine, 4 years into a war it was not supposed to survive, has converted its experience of near-total destruction into the world's most valuable military export. It has turned Iranian drone designs back against Iran's own regional strategy. It has walked into the Middle East during a crisis and offered something that Washington, London, and every defense contractor in the world could not match. Proof of concept proven under fire against the exact weapon Iran is using. Russia wanted the Gulf states to remain in its orbit. Iran wanted to demonstrate that no power could challenge its control of Hormuz without paying an unbearable cost. Ukraine wanted to survive. Of the three ambitions, only one is being achieved on schedule. The situation is still fluid, the ceasefire is fragile, the Ukrainian drone systems will take time to integrate, train on, and deploy at scale. The Strait of Hormuz remains a contested space with no permanent settlement in sight. Ukraine is still fighting Russia on its own soil and counting every missile and every drone it sends abroad against the reserves it needs at home. But something fundamental has shifted in the architecture of this crisis. A country that started the war with no navy and no allies in the Gulf is now a strategic partner of three of the world's wealthiest energy states. Its drones are being studied by military commanders who 6 months ago had never heard of the Sea Baby. Its engineers are advising on defense systems protecting critical Gulf infrastructure. Its tactical experience is being translated into a system that could make Iran's blockade strategy as costly in the Gulf as it ultimately proved in the Black Sea. Russia built a fleet and lost it to boats the size of jet skis. Iran built a drone strategy and is watching the exact countermeasure it inadvertently funded, through years of arming Russia, arrive in the Gulf. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is not the one your enemy expects, and sometimes the country that rewrites the rules is not the one that anyone saw coming. Ukraine came a long way to change this war, and it has only just arrived.